do you want me to, or wait, or start? Or?
I think we're all here.
People are all here? Okay, I wasn't sure. Okay, so I'll start then, if everyone likes. And let me check the time just to make sure so I don't go over. I'll try to.
3:49.
Okay, 3:49, perfect.
Here, move your chair closer.
Let's see. All right, so I'll try to keep it to, I mean, we'll play it by ear. And then at the end, if people have questions or whatever, of course, you know, we can do that as well. So no, let me give you a little background as to what this is and how it came to be. So in September, I had been invited to go in September to sort of what you're doing here, but it was the English province doing it. So they were having their late provincial assembly, and they invited me to attend. So it was my first proper visit to the UK, which was nice, you know. They had it in Leicester, and so I went there, and they asked me to talk about, because they knew that I would be coming straight from, or almost immediately after, the general chapter in Krakow, and so they wanted sort of a little bit of a presentation about that as relates to the Dominican laity, you know, how to sort of translate that into what the laity does and so forth. So I put this together for that purpose. So basically, I'm giving you the same presentation. I just changed the words in the first first slide to say, you know, instead of saying English province or whatever. But that's what this is. So you may recall that in the beginning, the master had written a relatio, and you may know that, and maybe from previous chapters, those who have been in the fraternities long enough will know that the master of the order usually writes a letter known as a relatio before the chapter, when he convokes the chapter. And that letter sort of gives sort of major themes where he discerns, together with the Curia and so forth, the signs of the time, you know, what is it that the order is looking at collectively, what he's inviting us to look at. We also know that the order, the general chapter, pertains to the friars pretty much, right? So, for example, it doesn't. We don't have the ability to legislate for the apostolic sisters, for example, right? They're not within that purview. But we will come up with things that do, in a related sense, kind of impact the laity and the Dominican youth movement. Things do come up, even though obviously the laity have their own assembly and so forth, right? And I think there are many things, even though the chapter is a chapter for the, in a legislative sense, it's for the friars. But in terms of the themes, because the master is the sort of the symbol, the sign of the unity of the order, I think very often what he says in the relatio and some of the themes that are covered, they do impact the whole Dominican family and, you know, the whole order in a sense. And in fact, at the chapter, one thing that's been really neat about attending these, I usually, by the way, I'm there as a translator. I technically was not there as the promoter for the laity. I'll explain why in a minute, because it's kind of an interesting choice. I've been to several. I've been to, since 2013, since Trogir, I've been to all of them since then. And so, as an interpreter. And the thing that's interesting is that he always invites representatives of the other branches of the family. So you'll have a nun, or two perhaps, you know, you'll have an apostolic sister, you'll have someone always representing the lay fraternities, you always have somebody representing the priestly fraternities, and then if there's a special topic, like we've a couple of times, they've talked about the work of the Cooperator Brother Commission, so you'll have a friar who's a cooperator brother or two who might come and address the assembly, the delegates and so forth. So what's interesting is that because, from a legislative perspective, it pertains to the friars, obviously they're guests of the chapter, they don't vote on anything. However, they are participants in the commissions. They do have their voices heard, and they're part of the conversation in each commission and on the plenary floor, which means that their input, directly or indirectly, oftentimes will end up making it into our chapter acts. So they do indirectly kind of affect what comes out in a legislative sense, which is kind of cool, I think. I think that's a really neat thing. So anyway, what I'd like to do is share with you in the next slide what it was that was the overarching theme covered in that relatio that the master wrote to help orient us in the work of the chapter. And this slide I shamelessly stole from our the materials that were given to work with in preparation for the chapter. It's one of those snazzy ones that's animated, so there you go. And basically, this is just a graphic representation of what the master calls the four publics. Now, why does he talk about the four publics, and why are we talking about publics at all in this chapter in Krakow? Well, the first thing is that in previous, more recent chapters, the order had been working a lot on what we call the big buzzword was restructuration, right? So restructuration, which means that there was a need which was identified to restructure basically our provinces and so forth, vicariates. Now that's like gobbledygook maybe when, but it really was important because of the changing realities of where the friars were and what was going on, and the need to streamline a lot of things and to sort of change things around. So a lot of work was done in previous, in more recent chapters to address that. And the thing is, what the current master, what Father Gerard identified was that we've needed to look internally, and that's good, and we've done it. But now that that work is done, the restructuration of the order has been largely completed, and there are new entities and so forth, of the friars and whatnot, reconfigurations of how we're structured. Now we have to look at, why do the structures exist, right? Same thing here. Why do you have a lay Dominican rule? Why do you have a provincial directory? Yeah, you talked about that here you happen to have regions. Why do you have regions here? And in another province, they don't have them, right? So it's because at the end of the day, it's about what we do, how we go out. It's about the mission. It's about the preaching, okay? And our way of life, which is the foundation of the preaching, right? We are the holy preaching to begin with. The holy preaching is the community itself from the primitive days of the order, right? So that being said, the master rightly identified that we need to start looking at, okay, we've done all this restructuration. Now let's look out again and see who are we preaching to, and how can we now move out again and address, and he came up with this concept of the four publics. And the four publics are basically looking at reading the signs of the times, big theme today, looking around and seeing what are the some sort of major categories for understanding the complex reality socially that we have in the world today, and then how do we preach to these different constituencies, if you will, or these different assemblies, right? So the first one is, he talks about in medio ecclesiae, at the heart of the church, okay? So that's an intra-ecclesial preaching, which is always needed, okay? We need our faith, those of us who practice the faith and are committed in that practice, we need to have our faith always renewed. We need to continue growing in conversion, deepening, right? It doesn't just stop when we find Jesus, it just begins. And so the church is missionary by her very nature, and it's important for us to realize that the mission begins with us, begins within, okay? And preaching is begins with the Christian faithful. So he uses here the mission of St. Luke. I have decided to write an ordered account for you, Theophilus, so that you may learn how well founded the teaching is that you have received. That's a very interesting opening to a gospel, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Because basically it's the author of that gospel is basically addressing, he's preaching to the choir, to use to use an expression, right, a common expression. He's preaching to the choir. But the choir still needs preaching, right? So how do you do that, So that's what that is. deepening our own, the faith of the people that are already in the pews, and navigating and moving through, our own complexities, our own difficulties and challenges, both in ourselves and our communities and families and the world that we live in. And then there's Christian faithful. There's adyentes, persons in the different areopagi in our world. And here it's the mission of St. Paul. I even discovered an altar inscribed to an unknown God. What therefore you unknowingly worship, I proclaim to you. So in other words, preaching and parts of the world that maybe are not Christian, okay? And that's also, as always, remains an area to look at. People on the margins of the church. So notice you have the Christian faithful and people on the margins of the church. So these would be people who, they're Catholics, but they might be disappointed. They might have experienced the crucifixion, like those on the road to Emmaus, but they're not quite so sure about the resurrection. They really don't see it. They may feel they might be lapsed Catholics. They might be disappointed in the church. They might feel a bit abused, and I don't just mean the sex abuse scandal, although that could be one thing. It might be more subtle than that. They might feel like there's no place for them, right? And so they don't know what to do, because they kind of like Jesus and they like the sacraments, but they're in a very difficult space. One thing that's interesting too is this choice to include this verse from Luke to make the reference to Emmaus, to the Emmaus story. Particularly that verse, that their eyes were prevented from recognizing Jesus who was walking with them. It's a very interesting choice. Because I think that happens in many contexts. If you are disappointed, it's like in a love relationship or in a friendship. If you've disappointed me, or I feel that you've disappointed me, I might not be able to see in you the love that you may genuinely have for me. I might not believe it. So there's a veil over my eyes that's keeping me from trusting you, basically. And that's something that requires attentive being with, in a certain way. It's very important. But the recognizing of Jesus ultimately does happen in the breaking open of the scriptures and the breaking of the bread. So there's a sense in which it has to be a communal response. But what that looks like can be very complex and very different according to the reason that they're not near. And then again, persons in different areopagi. I won't go into that too much because we'll go into it further as we move on. And then there's this fourth category, the young people who are found in the other publics. Okay, so young people. So there are young people in the church, there's young people outside the church, there's young people on the margins of the church, there's young people who are really devout and they're on fire with the church, and so on. So it's the young. Now, one thing I did, let me just make a little disclaimer. So I quote the acts of the chapter here in several places in this presentation. So I just want to point out that the acts of the chapter are normally put out in the 3 official languages of the order. But what happens is that the commissions that are working on different topics, they're grouped by language. So what happens is, for example, I was serving as an interpreter for the Government and Economics Commission, okay? And they were a mixture, they were basically English and Spanish speakers. So I was helping, me and another brother, we were helping with interpreting for that. The document, the final document has to be in one of those languages. So in that case, I don't remember, I think it was in Spanish, but I don't recall. It could have been in English, I can't remember anymore. But you'll have things like that. So what'll happen is this commission, the document is in Spanish, this one it's in French, this one it's in English. So until the official translations are released, what happens is what you get online is they publish the acts, or there's a version of the acts available. I'm not sure if it's online yet. but there's a version available, it's complete. You've got the acts of the chapter, but every chapter's in a different language. Okay, depending on which commission, you know, you're reading. And then in the end, when they do the official translations, you know, but the source language is the original language that they worked from, because that's the language that they were written in to begin with, right?
Will they be published in each of the
Yes.
languages completely?
They will, and for all I know, they may be already, because I'm not sure, I haven't kept up with that to see if they've updated that or not. So it might already be available online, or it might be close to it.
And Latin is not one of those languages?
Well, because we're not talking in Latin, so.
You're not even reporting to the Vatican or?
I don't know if, because the thing is, I don't know if our acts, I'm not sure how that works in terms of like sharing at that level, or if it's necessary or not, so I'll plead the fifth on that one, I don't know. We do have some things that are in Latin,
I'm just curious.
but usually with this, because it's how we talk, you know, so it just, yeah, like we would have to literally lose meaning by translating it into Latin if we wanted to do that, basically. So the reason I say all that is because when I'm quoting, sometimes the quote is 100% accurate because I'm taking it from, the original is English and I'm just copying it. Other times it was in another language and I'm translating it. So I'm just, you might read it in the final approved version and say, wait, that sentence sounds off. You know, is that what it says exactly? That's why. All right. So anyway, this is from the Acts. Speaking of mission was in itself a challenge, for to evoke this vast field, whose breadth was represented by the capitulars coming from the four corners of the world, as you know, we're coming from all over the place in a general chapter, requires acknowledging its immense diversity, and the work of enculturation of preaching necessarily entails. One might therefore have undertaken a reflection according to cultural or linguistic areas, but the chapter chose instead to treat this mission as a single reality, the very object of our order, itself considered in its uniqueness. So, let me just translate something for you. You may already know what this is, but I'll mention it anyway just in case. When it mentions enculturation, do you know that? Okay. It's a word that was, curiously enough, it's a word created within the field of contemporary theology. It did not exist. If you use it in a secular context, it doesn't exist. The word that exists in a secular context is acculturation, with an A, acculturation, which is different. Acculturation from an anthropology would be, you leave the United States to go live in Peru, like our Pope, right? You go to live in Peru, you learn Spanish, you interact with the people, and then you start acquiring elements of the Peruvian culture, and you become kind of Peruvian-ish while you're still American. That would be an example of acculturation, you know, or an immigrant coming to the U.S. It's the same process, it's acculturation. Now, inculturation is different. Inculturation is a theological sort of term which refers to taking the faith, and think of the incarnation, okay? It's the faith incarnating into a particular culture. So how do we, you know, like when the Spanish arrived in the New World, oh, I have it on here. I'll show you at the end. It's my screen, it's my wallpaper, okay? It's from a Dominican convent. It's now a museum. But when the Dominicans arrived in Mexico, we usually think of the Franciscans when we think of Mexico, because they did take, but they were more like the center to the north, which included what's now the southwestern U.S., which is why when you watch Zorro, you always see like a Franciscan friar, you know, wandering around or whatever. Yeah. You never see a Dominican, you know. But if it's something set in South America, there's Dominicans galore. Because what ended up happening was that in the Spanish Empire, the Dominicans kind of evangelized like South America and the Caribbean and stuff. Well, it was kind of mixed. But like Mexico kind of became sort of Franciscan territory more so. But I mention all this because the missionaries who came, the Dominicans, who when they came initially at an early stage, they were especially in what today is southern Mexico, and the word enculturation didn't exist, but that's what they were doing. They were looking at the indigenous cultures, and they were trying to figure out how to use their customs to try to explain the gospel, the sacraments, and so forth. So for example, they had architecturally, they said, okay, these people are doing a lot of worshiping outdoors in nature because they're very attuned to nature. It's, you know, a lot of Native American, whether it's North Central or South America, Native American thing of the land and the nature and the whole thing. And the earth, the land that you're on is like an axis mundi and that whole thing. So there's a lot of outdoor worship going on. So they would build the churches, the Dominicans would have the churches built, and they would have these outside areas for sort of, you know, kind of liturgical, sacramental type, popular sort of things that they could do outside. So things like that, or they would talk about baptism by recourse to what baptism does by talking about the jade water, because jade was sacred to them and they saw it as purifying and renewing them and that kind of thing. So anyway, that's enculturation. So what it's saying, and I'll show you an image at the end about what I'm talking about. But so what it's saying here is that in the reflection of the chapter initially, they're saying, okay, we're addressing these four publics, which are very different and so forth. And we're coming from different cultural backgrounds. So we were thinking maybe that's the way to go, but then they thought, yes, that's something that you always have to look at, obviously. You know, how do you preach in this cultural context versus that one? But they decided that it was also important to make sure that they treated the mission as a single reality, right? Because even if we do it differently, in a sense, we're doing the same thing, you know, wherever we go, in terms of trying to reach these publics. So that's what that's saying. And here we have that from different trips that I've made. This was in Krakow with the chapter. Those are two lay Dominicans that I met there. These are lay Dominicans in Pakistan when I was in Pakistan. These are lay Dominicans here in the United States. There's Kathy.
East New York.
There she is.
Yeah, that's Dick's house.
That's right.
Dick Fitzgerald.
That's right.
Fancy Coleman up there. Yeah, yeah.
Ah.
That's Scott. That's the guy I was telling you is doing the radio. Scott up there.
Yes, and I think I remember when you mentioned him, I was wondering if it was him that you were talking about.
Yeah.
And then, yes, and then, and this was, I was in Madagascar, and this was fun. You can't see the whole picture, but this is the, so this is the friar. He's the only friar from Madagascar in the order in the world. Madagascar is part of the province of Toulouse, and so they have like 3 friars, but he's the only one who's actually from Madagascar, which is really cool. And so anyway, we were there, and he took us to visit, and the lay fraternities, he took us to visit a bishop, an auxiliary bishop who'd recently been appointed, I think by Leo recently. Like it was Leo was like just elected and put this guy in, I think. And we met him, and that's the bishop with the flute. He's a musician. So they started jamming. It was awesome. We were jamming in the bishop's office, which was really neat. So anyway, that's the tapestry of the order. That's who we are, you know. And okay, so first group, I've already said a little bit, Christian faithful. This was a mass in Miami where I presided, and it was the both reception and also profession of various lay Dominicans into these fraternities in South Florida, which didn't exist like 2 years ago. And the one that you see here making her simple profession in front of Donna, that's my sister Maria. So,
What church is this?
St. Dominic's in, you know, right there, that's where I lived for 8 years before coming to Rome. Yeah. So anyway, that's what that is. But I picked the images, and one thing I want to point out, which is very interesting, when we're talking about preaching to the Christian faithful, it is very or any of these groups, it is very tempting to think monolithically, to think in a very single, sort of united way. But we know that's not true, right? The diversity, both good and also tense, and everything that exists both inside and outside in every single community. So, you know, for example, if you didn't know these people and you walked in off the street, but you're Catholic, so you know enough, you know you're Catholic in the United States, so you have like a picture of different groups and who they are and what they're like. You know, you see a couple of ladies with veils, you know, with mantillas. Everybody seems to be, you know, looking in a particular way, whatever. You might automatically have a picture of what this group is like. You might have a picture of what their liturgical preferences are, and how they like to worship, and how they might approach lay Dominican life. And you might be correct in some sense, but you also would probably miss that if you were to talk to those people individually, some of them would probably fit your expectations, and others might be totally the opposite, right? But they're together in the same fraternity, right? And similarly, you might go to another church, as we all know, and people might be dressed very differently. You might not see a single mantilla, right? And you might see people doing something completely different. And again, you might have a set of assumptions, and maybe, you know, it'll match for some and it won't match for others, right? So the whole thing is, when we're building up each other's faith, when we're preaching to each other, in a sense, or with each other, we do need to consider and not sort of put each other in boxes. And think, you know, and also, how do I talk to you? You know, if I'm talking to you, I'm not going to talk to you in the way that I talked, let's say, when I was in Peru. Not just because it's a different language, but because it's a different cultural context. There are things happening in the US that are different than what's happening down there. You know, so it's like, it's going to condition how we say things. Sometimes, you know, there might be a crowd where using, for example, I always like to say, even intra-ecclesially, there might be a crowd where using, right off the bat, a very classical, structured, let's say Thomistic language is the key, it's the way in. And there might be another crowd where it's going to set up a wall. But you're saying, you can say the same thing, and you could still use that language, but you might bring in other things, and you might have an in. So it depends on who you're talking to. You can start in the same place, or you could start someplace different and end in the same place. There's different ways, and so we have to think critically. But it's not only when we're dealing outside of the church, it's also when we're dealing inside the church. So it's important for us to remember that, right? Adgentes, persons in the different Areopagi in our world. Now, of course, as we know, this is a reference in Acts of the Apostles when Paul, he goes to the Areopagus, right? He goes to Greece, he's in Greece, he goes to the Areopagus, the Mount of Ares, the god of war, right? He goes up there and he finds an altar to an unknown god. And he basically acknowledges the fact that these people know something of the mystery of God. They have some kind of relationship with God. Even though they're not Jews, they're not Christians, they're probably also worshiping Ares and, you know, Zeus and whoever, but he's acknowledging that within that, they do have some kind of relationship with God. So there's something to start from. He's not going in automatically thinking, you know, you people are a bunch of like lost pagans who just have no clue, you know? And this is important because when we deal with people who might not be within the church or who might not even know Christ, we need to acknowledge that the gospel is already present waiting. This is something a lot of missionaries have been saying for years. The gospel is already there waiting for us in some fashion. It doesn't mean that they have everything and they don't need what we have to bring, because otherwise why would we bring anything, right? You know, but there's something already there. It's a question of, you know, helping it to grow and germinate, right? And then develop and transform. And some of what they have can also feed the gospel within us, right? There are things, you know, a religion does not have to be, you know, even 60%. It could just be 40% true. But that 40% can teach me something. It can help me as a Catholic understand some truth of my faith, like the mystery of the Incarnation or the mystery of the Trinity, in a way that I wouldn't have understood it just using what Augustine said or what Thomas said or what, you know, what Torres of Lisieux said or something like that. So these are important things for us to remember. in a certain sense, when I encounter an Areopagus, I'm bringing something, but it should also help me in terms of deepening my awareness of the mystery of God. Not just because I converted them or something, but also because they may have some theological insight that I'm lacking, okay? This image was interesting to me because when I was looking for images, this one I just swiped off of Google. But the thing that caught my attention was that it was, I think I put like the unknown altar to the unknown God or something like that. And this was one of the ones that came up. And what I discovered, I didn't know this, apparently in the ancient world, there were several such altars erected. It wasn't just the one that, so what Paul saw in Athens was actually not at all uncommon, yeah. And it's interesting that and we know this today, we have enough of a history being Westerners, with ancient Greece and Rome and so on, that we know that even in Greco-Roman paganism, that the philosophers reached a point where they kind of deduced there's some sort of truly divine reality that is behind, even when we talk about Hera or Aphrodite or whatever, there's something behind that that's even more transcendent, more godly in a sense.
This is why Thomas found so much good fruit in Aristotle.
Exactly. That's why he was able to not just dismiss Aristotle as some stupid pagan or something. He was able to see this, or even before Thomas, when they were using Neoplatonic, ideas. I mean, one of the things that made Thomas threatening, because of, in the church, he wasn't immediately received with open arms. Like in the University of Paris, they thought of him, they thought he might be a heretic, right? So it always happens. They think they're a heretic, and then eventually they get rehabilitated and they become part of the tradition. It happened with Yves Congar, it happened with, So there's this, it's just that's a discernment that's made by the church over time, right? And, there's always a separation of the dross from the good and so forth. But it's part of the normal process of development of doctrine, right? So basically what one of the things that they didn't like was he was bringing in some of these Aristotelian categories, and it just something, they had different reasons why they were suspicious of that. In fact, in the Orthodox Church, there are still many, not all, because they do have elements of that have influenced some of their theological development as well. But there's a tendency to be very distrustful. One of the things they critique about us, they say we're not very traditional to them because we embraced Aristotle. Because of the scholastics. They feel like that's one of the points where, according to them, they feel that we got away from the true faith in a sense, or that we diluted it somewhat. So it's interesting. So in his relatio, and of course this is the master of the order reminds us that, quote, the place of mission is no longer only far from home, it is also close to home. Okay, so there's, what it's acknowledging is there's two forms of agentes. Agentes is not only going to a faraway country where people never heard of Jesus. That's one way, that's one part, one aspect of it, but it's not the only aspect. Sometimes it's close, okay? It's reaching out both to those who have never encountered Christ and to those shaped by a cultural Christianity in which the image of Jesus gets distorted. So there's also that, okay? Yet both are part of the same mission, to proclaim Christ as Savior beyond historical and cultural boundaries. Okay, the young people. So let me just tell you a little bit. So of course these are young friars, except for that one. They're from Colombia. They were a lot of fun. They were fellow translators in the chapter. So obviously friars, not lay Dominicans, but still, and this was a gathering of the Dominican family there in Krakow. And there were, actually, they have lay fraternities with also very young membership. And they have a thriving youth ministry in Krakow, which my understanding is that historically John Paul II had a lot to do with that, which is very interesting. But so we were doing, every day the liturgy is in a different language at a general chapter. So what happens is you've got French day, English day, Spanish day, right? And so every time it's done a little differently. This time the coordinator would ask us, and we would, sing or do whatever. So I did a little bit sometimes the Spanish days, sometimes the English days. So on the Spanish days, there was a small group of us who would always go up and do stuff. And I remember one day we were doing Spanish, and there was a rehearsal, and the friar who was coordinating, his name was Lucas. Lucas was coordinating, and he put out a call for musicians. Now this is like the day before, okay? And like, I think he put it on Facebook or something. And then there were like almost 20 like young adults who looked like they were in their 20s, like they looked like college kids or something, with like instruments and things, and they just showed up, So it was pretty neat. And then we were like jamming and whatever and rehearsing particular pieces of music, and the next day we did it, and it was great. So anyway, the young people. This is Cristina. Cristina Exposito is from the province of Spain. She's from Valencia, and she's on the International Commission of the Dominican Youth Movement. So in the same way that Kathy is on the International Commission of the Lay Fraternities, ICLDF, there's also an IDYN, which is the International Commission of the Youth Movement. So anyway, she was there at the chapter representing the youth movement, and she was on they put her obviously on the commission about the youth, and she made some very good contributions. So this is another area where, again, a lot of presuppositions that we might have kind of fall down. When I was at Barry University as university chaplain, I had a particular experience. Friars who might work at a Newman Center, which is a different animal, will have a very different experience than the one that I had. Because when you're at a Newman's, because for example, when you're at a university like Barry, it is a Catholic university, not in a very, they didn't have a very sort of, a very robust sort of Catholic population, in the sense that you had students who were Catholic, students who were not, but many students who were Catholic, a number of them, they were not in the majority by any means. They would come to Mass. Some might choose to commute and go to Mass elsewhere, but there wasn't a sense of a strong Catholic student presence. And a lot of what we had to do also was to appeal to students who were not Catholic. And often what you would also find is there were students who would come to Mass who were not Catholic, who would never darken the door of a Catholic church, either because they didn't feel welcome or because of this or that, or they were from another tradition. They were Protestant. Maybe they came from like a Pentecostal family or something. But they liked the preaching, they felt welcome, they liked the warmth, and they needed it, and they felt alone, and they felt like, and they were like, I've got something here. So even if they didn't, whether or not some of them would join RCIA and would become Catholic, but there were others who didn't. But even those that didn't would come. There were some who would come pretty faithfully because there was something there for them, and they were drawing closer to Jesus. And they were learning to value the Catholic tradition in a way that they hadn't previously. So even if they didn't convert, there was that sense like, oh, there's something to this. This is an intelligent tradition with deep roots, with a history, and they're Christian. It would help break down a lot of those things. Even if they weren't ready to cross the Tiber or whatever you want to call it. So you had those. Then you had the ones who had like no interest in religion whatsoever. But what I found was, and many of us would comment on it, is it wasn't necessarily that they had animosity. It's not that they hated the church, because you do have that too. That does exist, obviously. But there are elements in the culture that might, lead you to think like the church is not for you. It's bad for you, whatever. So you do have that. But there probably are many more that they grew up unchurched. They just don't know. So. Right, it's like a thing, like telling you about the Lions Club. Like, why should I have nothing against them, but why would I want to join? That sort of thing. And so with those people, you find that it's more, in a way it's an advantage because it's not like you have to do away with a lot of baggage. It's more a question of why is this relevant, But what's interesting, what I found was that even those people, and even some who might identify as atheists, there's still a spiritual hunger.
Yeah.
They will say, I'm looking for something. And even sometimes if they'll say that they're atheists, which there were not that many, but the ones that did, it was like, I don't believe in God, but I like hearing, I like the message you give when you preach. So they were hearing something that sounded, even though they would maybe like to take the God stuff out of it or something, but they liked it. And it's like, if I ever became a religious person, this is something that would appeal to me or something like that. What's that? Yeah.
Oh no, it was Herod.
Herod, yes.
We'd like to hear it. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
And what's interesting to me is that this also points to something that we believe very strongly in our tradition, which is that, the hunger for God is an anthropological constant. It's fundamental to human nature. So even if you don't, that's why if you try to, and you've seen this with, for example, regime, like when the Soviet regime and some of the communist regimes in the 20th century that tried to exterminate religious belief and practice and tried to indoctrinate people out of it. If you don't have a religion, you'll invent one. You're going to invent one because you can't do without it, even if it's not a religion in the sense that we think of, but there's a sense of you're going to value something in that way, an intangible thing, and you're going to pour yourself out for it because we're made for that. It's part of being human. There's no way around it, So that's very interesting. The spiritual hunger is always there. Now, people on the margins of the church, and we've already hinted a little bit at this. Now, picking an image for this was sort of difficult because I thought, well, what images should I pick? Because there's a lot you could pick. But then some people might like it, some people might get, upset or this or that. So instead I thought, let me take an image.
It's like the synod from synodality.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the reason I picked that is because even though that's not the margins of the church, obviously it's a synod, right? But because the idea of the synod on synodality was to invite to varying degrees as appropriate, sometimes more in the initial process of the research and the gathering of and the listening sessions, and then maybe a little less, and then it's more intra-ecclesial when you get to the actual gatherings in the Vatican or whatever. There was still an effort to listen to people at varying degrees of relatedness to the church. Both people who are in the pews and practicing committedly, all these four publics were basically consulted. And so the idea was to sort of listen. How is the Holy Spirit, what does the Holy Spirit have to say to us from all these different corners, with all these different combinations of virtue and vice, of truth and error and everything in between? How does all of this, how is the Spirit speaking to us? And even the methodology on the synod floor, which obviously now they're Catholics, but you have bishops, you have clergy, you have laity, you have sisters, you have religious and different kinds of people coming together and listening to each other and listening for the Spirit. It's interesting because sometimes it gets caricatured as this sort of aimless, sort of just listen to each other and to any nonsense, and then we don't stand for anything, But in reality, there was a process. And the process involved, rooted very much in Ignatian spirituality, was very much a process of we pray, we pray together, we invoke the Spirit, and we listen. What we're listening for really is the Spirit speaking through our interaction with one another, which is what Dominican spirituality also is about. One of the interesting things, and I'm still learning it, and I've gotten more insight recently after all my years in the order, is this idea that I heard from some of the brothers that the way of doing Dominican democracy, which is interesting, is actually that, or Dominican governance, because the word democracy really doesn't show up in our fundamental constitutions. Father Gerard always points that out, which is interesting. It doesn't show up. Instead, it's communitarian government. That's really more. It's the community, government in the community. It's an interesting thing because what they've pointed out to me, it is itself a spirituality. It isn't just the way that we make decisions or the way that we vote on stuff. Because one of the principles in this is that the Dominican way, it's not just about the majority rules out. It's not like we ask whether, like, about suppressing a fraternity or whatever. It's not that, well, 8 out of 10, so therefore it's a go. It's more than that. There's a spirituality, very biblical in fact, of striving to act and to think and to feel in one mind and one heart. Which is also when you think of thinking with the church, right? So the idea is not that everybody's going to agree in the end. Remember that when we have these things that we're trying to like preach, and this is where we fail sometimes in our preaching, it's an eschatological horizon. Okay? It's an eschatological horizon. All right? Meaning, you ain't going to get it right, I ain't going to get it right until we're dead, okay? Until we're risen. But we keep growing in it. So like, that's why it's okay if this one, oh yeah, he can't be in the fraternity, he can't profess because, you know, his life isn't totally, well, aren't we all moving in a direction? Isn't it also about where we're headed and where we want to head and how we accompany each other in moving in that direction? That's got to factor in too, because if that's the case, then probably nobody should profess anything. So basically, we have to think that in the way that the spirituality of Dominican governance is that we have this eschatological horizon of one mind and one heart. So it isn't enough to just have a majority vote. For example, if you still have a lot of bad feelings about it, or you have, and it's about coming to a point where we really are all focused, we're trying to trust the Spirit. So even though I may feel that my position was objectively better, and I'm thinking this may be a mistake, and I could be right. I mean, in the end, you know, chapters can vote on stuff and be wrong, right? But what will happen is, it's trusting that we have debated, we have listened to each other. I feel that you've tried to listen to me as much as possible. That, you know, I tried to do my due diligence to let my voice be heard. That we did it in a spirit of prayer and charity. That we really worked as hard, we took it as far as we could take it, and now we're going to trust the Spirit. And that means that even if it's a mistake, the Spirit's got this. And we will see, and even that mistake will somehow be used to bear fruit. And so we will move in the spirit of trusting and letting the Spirit guide the community. Now, that's a spirituality. That's not just about governance, you know? So this is something that if we do that, and it's big.
Yeah.
And if we learn to do that with each other, you know, in line with our rule or our constitutions, whatever in the branch that we're in or whatever, it does help us grow in holiness. It does help us be better preachers, because then we become we develop virtues from that we then enable us to be better preachers and to be able to speak with some relative authority about what we're talking about, because it's always a relative authority. Remember, eschatological horizon. We're always preaching about something that we're failing to do, right? Sorry.
A model for this, in my mind, is how Luke describes the Council of Jerusalem, and how they all sort of fall into place with each other after some serious debate.
Yeah. Well, even like, look at the reception of an ecumenical council. This is something that's been studied, that we have historical data on. You know, they say that it takes about 100 years for an ecumenical council to be received. That means, you know, Trent, Nicaea, Chalcedon, Vatican II, whatever it is. It's never just that, like, okay, we're going to put out the documents and all the ducks are in a row. It's like, no. Do you know how long it took for Arianism to disappear?
Still around.
Well, yeah, under other names, but as Arianism, right? Like with that title, with that name. So like if you look at, for example, like, so, all right, Athanasius I, 4th century, right? Okay. You know that after the fall of the Roman Empire, you had all of these Germanic tribes that came south and conquered all of the Roman territories. And that's why even the Romance languages all have these lovely Germanic words and names, you know. Even Spanish and Italian and Portuguese, we have a lot of, we have names and surnames that are like Fernandez, Fernando, those are Germanic names. It's from Ferdinand, right? It's Germanic. So one of the things that happened was that in the case of Spain and Italy, they received Goths. The Goths were the tribes that, so we call the ones that were east the Ostrogoths, and the Western Goths were the Visigoths, right? So the Visigoths went to Iberia, Spain and Portugal. The Ostrogoths were in Italy. Now, they were, I think in Italy too, but certainly in Iberia, they were the ruling class. So the majority of the population in what today is Spain and Portugal, in Hispania, Roman Spain, would have been Orthodox. They were Hispano-Roman. They were known, we call them Hispano-Romans. So the Hispano-Roman population was largely Orthodox. But the ruling class, the Goths, were famous for being Arians. They actually were Arian. That's why when you go to Italy, you go to Ravenna, you've got two baptistries, and they're both really cool, right? You've got the Orthodox baptistry, and you have the Arian baptistry. And you can visit the Arian baptistry. It's awesome. It's not that big, but it's got some cool fresco art of Jesus being baptized and whatnot. And what you find is that I'm talking about, like, this is the fall of the Roman Empire. And then the Visigoths, they united Spain. It was the first time that the Spains had ever become one Spain since the Romans. And then shortly after, you had, then that fell because of the Moorish invasion, the Berber Muslim invasion from North Africa, right? So now, that Berber invasion happened in 711 AD, okay? 711 AD. The Visigoths remained Arian until sometime not long before that. They became Orthodox finally, formally, because of, the conversion of the king or whatever, I get the details muddy, sometime in the 7th century. So Athanasius, 4th century. The Visigoths stopped being Arian sometime in the 7th century. So think about that for a minute. And then you look at all of the councils, they take time. All this stuff, like for example with Vatican II, with people denying the council, defending the council, getting a more lenient interpretation of it, giving a more radical interpretation, giving everything in between. We're barely past the 50-year mark. So in reality, everything that we've seen and are seeing, we're on schedule, honey. We're on schedule. This is what's supposed to happen. And it's and the Holy Spirit works with things as they are, not as we would wish them to be, which includes our own tendency to divide, right? To be like fighting with each other or whatever. The Holy Spirit uses all of it, So we can trust that we're in good hands, even in our sins. God has us, as the church. So people on the margins, getting back to this, people on the margins in the church. One of the things that is important is to develop what what the Acts describe as a spirituality of listening for the mission. One of the things that Father Gerard always says, he's been saying this, is we've been doing synodality for 800 years. In the sense that, our governance system is one based on listening to the Spirit through the brothers and the sisters, okay? And so this is basically essential, because it goes back to sign of the times. We need to listen for the Lord, for the bridegroom, in the intimacy of the bridal chamber, as also at the wedding banquet table, like we did this morning, but also in the brothers and sisters that are at the banquet with us, and those that are outside that are not in the banquet. We've got to listen. If we don't do that, we're going to be in trouble. And one of the things that we need, and this is what both the previous pontiff and our current pontiff are trying to drill into us, is that we need to reflect at length on the method and the mission in today's context, noting that there can be no authentic preaching of the gospel without listening to the needs of our contemporaries, like Dominic and the innkeeper. We have to be willing to listen to what's going on, even the things that make us uncomfortable. And part of this is looking at what's happening. But that has to be, and this is, and I would say, when we're dealing with people who are estranged from the church, I'm not gonna get into specific groups, there are many. The one common denominator, if you're going to write or preach anything about any such community, if all you're doing is reading about it, whether from a great Thomistic philosopher, or from some document or something that came out of I don't know where, or from a news source that you like to read, and from data points from some study, don't preach about it. You're offering more by not preaching. If you want to preach about that community, talk to them. Read that stuff. Yes, you want to read that stuff. I'm not saying don't read it. Of course you want to read that stuff. You want to read sources, you want to compare them, you want to evaluate the information you're getting. The problem is, especially in this post-truth context that we're living in, where information is being weaponized by all sides, okay? And people are being played against each other by internal actors and by foreign actors. We know this. So when Pope Leo was elected, the day he was elected, on Facebook, there were multiple memes with pictures of him, with quotes, all fake.
Yeah.
And they were culture war type quotes. They were trying to align him either with one side or with the other. Divide. What's the Greek word for devil? Diabolos, the divider. That's right. So it's important to meet the people that you are feeling either passionate or fired up, or you want to meet them. Listen to them. Don't just tell them what the Summa says. Listen to them. Even if you feel like it's a string of errors, listen. What is going on? And then interact on a regular basis. Because what's going to happen is, and then also as you have your own discomfort and your own doubts, then read those sources. On the right, on the left, from a Thomist, from someone who's into Augustine, from someone who's into the mystics, read, read. But you need to have that listening and that closeness, because that is where, and then after doing that for a while with our mouth shut, eventually we will have something valuable to say. It won't be the whole answer. It might feel woefully incomplete, but we will have something to say, and it will be grounded, more sure that it will be grounded in the gospel. Okay. Wow, we got to the ratio.
And I think what ratio's on 9.
Yes.
And
Thank you for printing it. That was really, really neat.
it's so important.
Thank you.